Get some more on all of this. Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger is joining us. He's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, also a veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
You bet. Thanks.
How much capability does North Korea really have to carry out the threats we're hearing from them?
So I think North Korea does not, at least not that I know of, have the capability to sink a U.S. aircraft carrier with a single strike, as they say, or I guess what did he say last week, a super mighty preemptive strike, which is kind of a funny choice of words, but a very serious concern. But they do have the capability to, frankly, unleash hell on South Korea. And we have 20,000 American troops there. You take into account North Korea's nuclear ability, some estimate 10 to 25 nuclear weapons that they have currently, plus then their conventional artillery more forward located. I mean, this stuff is actually built into mountains that can pop out and shoot and pop back. So any increase in hostility, any actual formal war going forward would lead to a very massive casualty situation and a very, very bad situation for everybody involved.
Yeah, we have 28,000 U.S. military personnel along the demilitarized zone. I think another 50,000 or so in Japan. You heard President Trump, Congressman, say this is a problem we have to finally solve, but it's not for lack of trying on the part of his predecessor. So what options are there really?
So options are declining. I mean, look, the military threat, and it's a credible military threat that we have put out against North Korea, is, I think, used and utilized to force an economic instrument of power to be utilized and a diplomatic instrument of power. So diplomacy against an adversary can be only effective when it's backed up with a credible threat of force. So what you saw was a very real positioning by this administration to say, look, there are options to take out your nuclear capability, but we hope to be able to do it diplomatically, which is what they've pivoted to this week. This all actually works in conjunction with each other to try to get this done without any kind of a strike. But look, this is a very bad situation. I think this is important for Americans to understand when we talk about investing in missile defense. This is why when we talk about investing in the ability to destroy these missiles in their launch phase, in their early phases, because once an intercontinental ballistic missile goes up basically into space, there's not any options we have. So the early stage interception is very important, strengthening our allies, but hoping to God, frankly, that diplomacy works in this case.
Let's get to some other issues involving North Korea, Congressman. As you know, the president, he got personally involved to help secure the release of Aya Hijazi, a human rights worker who had been jailed in Egypt for 3 years. He worked with the Egyptian president to do that. Do you expect him to try to do something similar to get these 3 American citizens who are now detained in North Korea out? It's a very different situation, clearly.
Yeah, I think it's probably not going to happen from this administration. In the past, when folks have been released, it's been, outside folks going and negotiating that release. That may be the case. My guess is Kim Jong-un is actually gathering people to use as a bargaining chip for whatever he wants going forward. President Trump has a pretty good relationship with Egyptian President Sisi, and so my guess is in their talk, he said, look, this is very important to our relationship, and the president agreed to release the prisoner. North Korea is a very different situation. We have no diplomatic contact with them. Our best diplomatic contact, frankly, is through the Chinese. And while the Chinese appear to be coming on board, they still appear to have in their idea that North Korea is better than, as crazy as they are, than engaging them. And that's unfortunately a scary thing. We've got to raise the price on China.
Do you think it's time, Congressman, for the U.S. to directly engage with the North Koreans?
I don't. Look, all it does is legitimize Kim Jong-un. It puts him in a much stronger position to do that. He's a very bad leader, and I don't think, frankly, us engaging them directly at this point would lead to him denuclearizing. I think he's using nuclear as frankly, his final goal. Some people think he's doing this to try to get economic relief. I think he's doing this because he desperately wants to be a nuclear-armed country. And so I think direct engagement, it's not the time right now. There may be a point down the road that that's decided, but it's definitely not right now.
Let's turn to some other important issues this week. The efforts, for example, to reach a spending bill. The president wants funding for the border wall with Mexico. Is there support for that within your own party?
Yeah, I think there is. It's a promise he made to the American people. It was one of his biggest cheer lines when he was speaking at a rally. Look, I'm personally a believer in border security. I don't know if it needs to be a wall, but, you know, fencing in some areas, walls in some areas, technology in other areas. I've worked the border, actually, as Air National Guard pilot, and there needs to be more significant border enforcement. But it's a big promise he made. But there's a lot of talk now about a government shutdown. It happens every time we come up against a funding deadline. I would actually be very surprised if, in fact, we were right up to that deadline and saw the government shut down. I think we work our way through this. There's discussions happening with Democrats now. And while it'll be dramatic, I'm sure, I think ultimately we find our way through this.
As you know, the president has been relying on executive orders to deliver on some of the promises before this 100-day mark arrives on Saturday. He signed more executive orders in this time frame than any other president in the last 72 years. Do you agree with that approach?
You know, I think the president has a lot of leverage to do executive orders. Executive orders can deal with, you know, how a bureaucracy works, and in that case, yes, that's actually his responsibility as the executive branch. I'd like to see a lot more come through Congress, but unfortunately, you know, we've had difficulties when it came to the Obamacare replacement bill. The House Freedom Caucus sank that, and now we're back in negotiations. And so I think despite the president making an attempt in many cases to follow through on his promises, and I think he will follow through on the vast majority of them, if not all of them, it's our party, frankly, that has to get together and really realize sometimes you can't vote for a perfect bill. It's a good bill. We need to work together, and that's a learning process, I think, for Republicans in the House right now.
Congressman, we're getting new information on the Russians and Putin's effort potentially to interfere in yet another presidential election. We're going to have that and more. Thanks very much. We're back with Adam Kinzinger, the Republican congressman. Congressman, many Americans were unaware of the extent of Russian influence on the 2016 presidential election until afterwards. So what lessons should we be looking for as we see this French election play out over the next 2 weeks?
Well, this comes as absolutely no surprise to me or anybody that watches. This is Russia's MO. They're trying to create consternation within a country. They're trying to put their candidates in place. They interfered in the U.S. election, and we have an investigation underway on that. We knew this was going to happen in France. We knew this is going to happen in other elections in Europe. This is Vladimir Putin, a generally pretty weak country. It's not the old Soviet Union, but it's his way of trying to change the board. And if you look at the French election, for instance, Macron, pretty good guy, was in France last week. But Le Pen, I mean, this is part of a party that has expressed a lot of anti-Semitic views, that has said she wants to consider pulling France out of NATO and all these other things. And by the way, the French have been among the most forward-leaning partners in NATO in the war on terror. So this is no surprise to anybody that watches this stuff, but hopefully the French citizens are aware that the Russians are doing their best to pick their presidential candidate and pick their president, and they can push back.
So with the knowledge, Congressman, that Russia is apparently trying to tip the scale toward Marine Le Pen, was it appropriate for President Trump the other day to start making predictions about how last week's ISIS attack on the Champs-Élysées in Paris could help her candidacy?
No, I don't think so. I'm always uncomfortable when a U.S. president gets involved in other people's elections. It really is not something that's been done much in the past, if at all. Just like I'd be uncomfortable if a foreign leader endorsed, had it been Hillary or Donald Trump in our election. I think you allow a domestic election to be chosen by the folks in that country. And by the way, that's a message to Russia, too. Let the French pick their president. Quit trying to do your fake news stuff. Quit trying to steal information and embarrass people. But the French citizens need to know, and probably many are watching, what is happening and what's going on, and be able to push back against Russian interference in your domestic politics.
Do you believe, Congressman, that the Trump administration will hold firm on sanctions against Russia until Russia returns control of Crimea to Ukraine, as Secretary Tillerson said?
I certainly hope so. I think this is very important. When you look at, for instance, Latvia, we never recognized the Russian occupation of Latvia throughout the whole Cold War. I think to see that here. Despite some of what President Trump had said earlier, the administration and his current words have actually been very hawkish on Russia. So whatever's changed in that calculus, I think the Russians and Vladimir Putin need to know that the sanctions, at least as far as we're concerned, are going to be in place until he turns Crimea back to its rightful owner, which is Ukraine.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, thanks very much for joining us.
You bet.